As the year 2022 dawned upon the world, the global community was faced with an unprecedented economic recession. The once bustling cities were now quiet and desolate as businesses struggled to survive and people lost their jobs. The pandemic had taken its toll on the global economy, and the world was now facing the harsh realities of a severe recession. In the midst of all this, India too faced its own set of unique challenges. The country's economic growth had slowed down significantly, resulting in job losses and reduced consumer spending. However, the Indian government was not one to sit back and watch the country suffer. It implemented a range of measures to stimulate the economy and bring the recession down to 0%. This is the story of India's journey through the economic recession of 2022. It is a story of challenges and resilience, of hardships and hope. Join us as we delve into the causes of the recession, the impact it had on the country, and the measures taken by the government to counter its effects. Discover the stories of ordinary people who were affected by the recession and how they persevered in the face of adversity. This is a story of the recession in the whole world, India's fight against the recession, and how the country emerged stronger and more resilient than ever before. This is a story of hope, of courage, and of the unbreakable spirit of the Indian people. So, sit back, relax, and join us on this journey through India's economic recession of 2022. The year was 2022, and the world was bustling with life and energy. The economy was thriving, businesses were booming, and people were enjoying the fruits of their labor. It seemed like nothing could go wrong. However, there was something sinister lurking beneath the surface. In the shadows, the central banks of the world were working tirelessly to keep the economy afloat. They were fighting a battle against an invisible enemy, the COVID-19 pandemic, which threatened to bring the world to its knees. The pandemic had caused widespread disruptions to the global supply chain, leading to shortages and price increases for goods and services. However, the central banks saw an opportunity to inject trillions of dollars into the economy through stimulus packages, low interest rates, and other measures. They hoped that this would stimulate growth and prevent a recession. At first, it seemed like their efforts were paying off. The stock market was bullish and businesses were thriving. People were spending money like there was no tomorrow, and everything seemed perfect. But little did they know that they were living in the calm before the storm. The pandemic was still raging, and the economy was built on a shaky foundation. The excess liquidity in the system was fueling inflation, and the labor market was severely impacted by the pandemic. The central banks knew that they were playing a dangerous game, but they had no other choice. They had to keep the economy afloat, or risk a recession that could cause widespread damage. However, they did not realize the true extent of the danger that they were facing. They did not realize that they were creating a bubble that would eventually burst, leading to a recession of epic proportions. In the shadows, there were whispers of a looming crisis, but nobody paid them any attention. People were too busy enjoying the good times to pay heed to the warnings. It was a time of great optimism and hope, but little did they know that it would all come crashing down in the months to come. The calm before the storm was just an illusion, and the world was about to experience a reality that was far harsher and more unforgiving. As the days went by, the pandemic raged on, and the global economy began to falter. The central banks knew that they had to act fast to prevent a catastrophe, but it was too late. The perfect storm had arrived, and it was fueled by a variety of factors that nobody could have predicted. The world was about to experience a recession like no other, and it was all because of the calm before the storm. The central banks had created a monster, and they had no idea how to tame it.
As the pandemic continued to wreak havoc on the global economy, the central banks were forced to take drastic measures to keep the system afloat. However, their efforts only fueled a growing bubble that was bound to burst. In the shadows, there were whispers of a looming crisis, but nobody paid them any attention. People were too busy enjoying the good times to pay heed to the warnings. Meanwhile, the stock market was reaching new heights, and businesses were thriving. But underneath the surface, there were cracks that were slowly growing larger. The first factor that contributed to the perfect storm was inflation. The excess liquidity in the system was fueling price increases for goods and services, which impacted the purchasing power of individuals and businesses. The central banks tried to control inflation through a variety of measures, such as raising interest rates and tightening monetary policy. However, these measures only served to stifle growth and put a strain on the already struggling economy. The second factor was the labor market. The pandemic had caused widespread job losses and disruptions to the global supply chain, which led to a shortage of workers in certain industries. The shortage of workers caused wages to rise, which further fueled inflation. It also put a strain on businesses, which struggled to find the workers they needed to keep their operations running smoothly. The third factor was the supply chain disruptions caused by the pandemic. As countries closed their borders and implemented lockdowns, the global supply chain was severely impacted. The fourth factor was the rising debt levels of countries and individuals. The stimulus packages provided by the central banks injected trillions of dollars into the system, which led to a rise in debt levels. As debt levels rose, individuals and countries became more vulnerable to economic shocks, which could lead to defaults and bankruptcies. The fifth factor was the geopolitical tensions that were simmering beneath the surface. Countries were engaged in a game of economic warfare, imposing tariffs and sanctions on each other in an attempt to gain a competitive advantage. This led to a breakdown in global cooperation and a rise in nationalism, which further exacerbated the economic problems facing the world. All these factors combined to create the perfect storm that led to the economic recession of 2022. The bubble that had been growing for years finally burst, and the world was plunged into chaos.
The economic recession of 2022 had a profound impact on the world. The recession hit the world like a tsunami, leaving behind a trail of destruction. The stock market crashed, businesses closed down, and people lost their jobs and their homes. The effects were felt everywhere, from the wealthiest nations to the poorest. The first effect of the recession was a spike in unemployment. Businesses were forced to lay off workers and job opportunities became scarce. People who had worked their entire lives found themselves without a job and without a safety net. The second effect was a rise in poverty. As unemployment rose, so did poverty. People who had once been able to provide for their families found themselves struggling to put food on the table. The third effect was a rise in crime. With poverty and unemployment on the rise, crime rates also increased. People turned to illegal activities to make ends meet, and the government struggled to maintain law and order. The fourth effect was a rise in social unrest. People who had been hit hardest by the recession took to the streets to demand action from their governments. Protests and demonstrations became commonplace, and the world was plunged into a period of turmoil. The fifth effect was a rise in political instability. As the social unrest grew, so did the political instability. Governments around the world were toppled, and new leaders emerged to take their place. The fallout from the recession was devastating, but countries around the world took measures to control it. The first measure taken by governments was to provide stimulus packages to their citizens. These packages included direct cash payments, tax breaks, and investment in infrastructure projects. The second measure was to implement monetary policies to control inflation and stabilize the economy. Central banks around the world lowered interest rates and injected liquidity into the system to prevent a complete economic collapse. The third measure was to address the labor market. Governments invested in job creation programs and retraining initiatives to help people find work and adapt to the changing job market. The fourth measure was to address the supply chain disruptions caused by the pandemic. Governments worked to diversify their supply chains and invest in local production to reduce their reliance on global supply chains. The fifth measure was to address the rising debt levels of countries and individuals. Governments implemented debt relief programs and worked to stabilize their economies to prevent further economic shocks. The measures taken by governments helped to stabilize the economy and prevent a complete economic collapse.
As the world emerged from the economic recession of 2022, it was clear that the world would never be the same again. The first aftermath of the recession was a new era of economic growth. The measures taken by governments to control the recession had a positive impact on the economy, and the world entered a period of sustained economic growth. However, this growth was tempered by a new awareness of the risks and vulnerabilities of the global economy. The second aftermath was a new era of social consciousness. The recession had exposed the deep inequalities of the global economy, and people around the world demanded greater social and economic justice. Governments responded with policies to address poverty, inequality, and the environment, ushering in a new era of social consciousness. The third aftermath was a new era of geopolitical competition. The recession had accelerated the shift in power from the west to the east, and new powers emerged to challenge the established order. The world entered a new era of geopolitical competition, with countries vying for influence and power in an increasingly complex and interconnected world. The fourth aftermath was a new era of technological disruption. The recession had accelerated the pace of technological change, and new technologies emerged that transformed the way we live and work. The world entered a new era of technological disruption, with new opportunities and challenges for individuals, businesses, and governments. The fifth aftermath was a new era of global cooperation. The recession had shown the need for greater cooperation and solidarity in times of crisis, and the world responded with a new commitment to global cooperation. Countries worked together to address common challenges such as climate change, pandemics, and economic inequality, ushering in a new era of global cooperation. The aftermath of the recession was complex and multifaceted, and it was clear that the world had changed forever. The lessons learned from the recession would shape the future of the global economy and society for decades to come. As the global community was faced with an economic recession in the year 2022, India was not immune to the effects of the crisis. The country experienced a significant slowdown in its economic growth, which resulted in job losses and reduced consumer spending. The causes of the recession were multifaceted and complex, including the decline in global trade, the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic, and increasing geopolitical tensions. One of the main factors that contributed to India's economic slowdown was the decline in exports. The global trade environment had become increasingly uncertain, and trade tensions between major economies had heightened. The COVID-19 pandemic had also disrupted global supply chains, which had a significant impact on India's export-dependent industries, such as textiles and electronics. The combination of these factors led to a decline in exports, which had a significant impact on the Indian economy. Another factor that contributed to the recession was the COVID-19 pandemic. The pandemic had a significant impact on India's economy, as businesses were forced to shut down, and consumer spending decreased. The pandemic also disrupted supply chains, which impacted the manufacturing sector and led to a decline in production. In addition, the pandemic had a significant impact on the services sector, which is a significant contributor to India's GDP. The closure of schools, offices, and other public spaces had a significant impact on the hospitality, transportation, and entertainment industries. To counter the effects of the recession, the Indian government implemented a range of measures to stimulate the economy. One of the key measures was tax cuts, which were aimed at boosting consumer spending and encouraging businesses to invest. The government also implemented infrastructure spending, which aimed to create jobs and stimulate economic activity. In addition, the government introduced a stimulus package to support businesses and workers affected by the recession. The Reserve Bank of India also implemented monetary policy measures, such as interest rate cuts and liquidity injection into the financial system. These measures were aimed at making credit more accessible and affordable for businesses and individuals, and supporting economic growth. The central bank also introduced regulatory measures to support banks and ensure that the financial system remained stable during the crisis. As a result of these measures, India was able to bring its economic growth back to 0% by the end of the year. However, the country still faces significant challenges, including rising inflation and a widening income gap. These challenges must be addressed as the country continues to rebuild and recover from the recession.
In conclusion, the economic recession of 2022 will go down in history as a turning point, a moment of transformation, and a reminder of the power of human resilience and solidarity. The lessons learned from this crisis must be embraced as we move forward, and we must continue to build a better world for ourselves and future generations. We have the power to shape the world we want to live in, and it is up to us to ensure that we build a world that is just, sustainable, and equitable for all.